But there was a study by a sociologist at Notre Dame in which Abigail, can't remember, it'll come to me. She did this amazing study that showed that US companies in general assumed that black people were drug users and did not actually even consider them for positions based on this perception. She found this out through interviews, but she also found out that the best way to control for this was to drug test all applicants for jobs, cross race and ethnicity, gender, everything else. And by doing so, they found that it was they found that blacks were actually more likely to be hired because the stigma was replaced by something like a fact. But then I thought to myself, goodness, how could like a whole company decide that black people as a whole are drug users? Oh, okay, we'll get to that later. But anyway, it's a fascinating thing. I'm sure you think you fill out the application, it doesn't occur to you that they don't even know who I am, and they've made this massive set of assumptions that would produce significant discrimination. But what happens with colorblind racism? Colorblind racism focuses on individuals and imagines that none of that is really going on, that it's about culture, behavior, and discipline. And other studies have shown tremendous data about the most widely endorsed account among whites in particular, point to a supposed lack of motivation or willpower on the part of blacks as a key factor in racial inequality. So I will say, you know, it's a little bit depressing but true that this story over here is mostly winning in American society. Whether it's winning in absolute terms or just in that kind of subtle day-to-day, well, you know, you did great, Tricia, you must work hard. I'm like, oh, okay, are we going down the rabbit path here? Are we going? Yes, like, no, we're not. You know, this idea that you must be an exception. You've done something that, you know, some other people just never do. It can be that kind of subtle, or it can be all the way up to basically all of Fox News and Republican Party platforms, which pretty much rely on this ideology one way or another as a dog whistle, racial or otherwise. And it doesn't matter, you know, there may be other policies that they get right, but when it comes to this, it's entirely about behavior. So let me give you just a clear, simple example. There's so many to choose from. But in 2014, Paul Ryan came up with a 250-page report that was designed, it was called the War on Poverty 50 Years Later, because he's an expert on that. And so he writes this report, none of which actually makes this argument, but when he promotes the statement and the document itself, he goes on Bill Bennett's radio show and says the following. This is an explanation for why we have poverty and issues of inequality. We've got this tailspin of culture in our inner cities, in particular, of men not working, and just generations of men not even thinking about working, or learning the value and culture of work. And so there's this real culture problem here that has to be dealt with. So, you know, again, if we were to unpack all of the ways that joblessness takes place, it would be staggering in the formation of actions by other people. And yet this whole issue is really about just generations of people just not even thinking about work. I'm like, I didn't even think about working my whole life. Anybody ever met a person like that? I mean, I would like that for myself, but no one says this. This is a ridiculous thing. Now, I really want to point out that, you know, these views are not just the hardcore. It's the ideological work that needs to be done has to do really with the mainstream, because there's been a tremendous saturation of this argument. It's been everywhere in the mass media. So it shouldn't be surprising then, given both the argument that's made by colorblindness, but also the argument that relies on culture, that there's a huge racial disparity in what people think about when racial equality will be achieved. So this Lawrence Bobo, a sociologist who was then at Harvard, does a study that shows that 61% of whites think we've already achieved equality, racially speaking, and it's on the horizon.
Hey, greetings everybody. How are you doing? I hope you're doing super great from where you're watching us from. As you know, these are presenter Agent Stories, and I hope you are fine. Now, in today's video, we are going to talk about something more educational, something which has been scholarly looked into by different professionals. In today's video, this video features Tricia Rose. She's trying to explain how structural racism works. A perfect example is how black people are being portrayed. And as a result, the view of black people is immensely causing suffering of black folks, right? Because black folks can't get a job because of the stereotype that they are lazy, they won't work in those places. And these are stereotypes that are being embedded, right, in, the culture, in the ways people perceive black folks. Today's video gonna be exploring different things that I feel like it's important. Now, Trisha Rose's presentation, How Structural Racism Works, offers a critical examination of the deeply embedded systems that sustain racial inequality. She emphasizes that structural racism is not simply about individual prejudice, but a set of interlocking institutions, policies, and other social practices that create and maintain racial disparity. Unlike interpersonal racism, which involves direct acts of discrimination, structural racism operates in a way that often appears neutral on the surface but produces racialized outcomes. This makes it particularly insidious because it can persist without the explicit intent of individuals, allowing inequality to be continuously reproduced across generations. Dr. Trisha Rose underscores that understanding structural racism requires historical perspective, as these systems did not emerge spontaneously, but evolved from centuries of policies and designed to privilege certain racial groups over others. While they try to push the narrative about, for example, black folks, of course, at the end of the day, it is about black folks. They try to make sure that black folks look a certain way, but to them, it's normal to them. But the long-term consequences that these has towards black people, it's affecting them. For example, a stereotype going around that black folks are lazy, right? When a person want to hire a black people, they might, restrain themselves because of the fear that these people are going to take my company down, right? And I think the perfect example is what we have seen in the introduction of the video, because at the end of the day, when you take things practically, you get to realize that black folks are not like that. It is these things are embedded in the norms, in the ways that people believe black folks, right? I want us to watch this video. I hope this is a great presentation by Trisha Rose, and she's a scholar who talks about, racism in America, and it's important for us to get to learn from this. Now, for those who are watching us for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership for you to get, first-hand content before it reaches the public. And all in all, we all get to learn from these videos and the commentaries that I usually give. But until then, let's watch the video. I'll be back with my commentary as usual. Your presenter number one, Eugene Duck Stories. Let's watch the video. I'll be back.
For another 20. So 80% of white people think we're pretty much scot-free. We're almost home. I don't know what they're doing. Okay. They live in multiracial communities. Okay. Okay. Sorry. See, we're videotaping this. I got to keep it real. I got to stay on the page. Okay. All right. 17% of black people think we've achieved equality. 36 think it's on the horizon, and the other half are not so sure about when it's going to happen. But this is a very big gap. This is a significant gap in, if nothing else, perception. We don't know what education's about, but if the 61% of whites think we have already achieved it, and another 20 think it's around the corner, how in God's name do we convince those 80% of respondents that racism is an impediment? You see, so this perception drives a rejection of the consciousness you need to fight structural racism. Now, some people say this out of Pollyanna hopefulness. It's just right around the corner and, it's going to be fine. But there is a willful kind of resistance. So the focus on behavior, the belief that equality has already or will soon take place, work together to facilitate the rejection of policies that many think would, in fact, work to counter structural racism. And then we get the no special favors. This is Bobo's analysis of the General Social Survey data, in which he says between 1994 and 2008, roughly 3/4 of white respondents felt that blacks should overcome prejudice without special favors, just like other minority groups is claimed, minority groups like the Irish, the Italian, and Jews. Now, this is a very interesting problem because it illuminates the complexity around folding in ethnic groups that are marginalized versus the very significant category that race plays. Ian Haney Lopez's book, A White by Law, is a fascinating study about the shifting line of where whiteness begins and ends and how important that line is for what your opportunities will be. So anyway, if you take these two charts, and there's many, many others, again, this is just a thumbnail today. These numbers suggest that structural changes mandated by policies are not going to find too much support among most whites. And frankly, if you look at no special favors, that's 50% of black people, if you look at the line below it, right? That they're really not so interested in these so-called special favors either. And so when you think about something like Obama's obsession with the lift all boats approach, which I was particularly aggravated by. I thought, what would be the point of a black president if we're going to go this route again? It's a little essentialist of an argument, but I was kind of just hoping. But it's extremely important because there'll be no will. It'll be total impossible backlash, and this is why the ideology is so important. But I just want to spend 2 seconds on why 50% of black people might say this and why I think it's important. First of all, there's a long history among various positions that could be all considered under the rubric of black nationalism, where self-determination is a critical anti-colonial project, and thus any special favors is a problem because it has to do with submitting to a politically subordinated position inside of a society that doesn't find you to be acceptable. So there's certainly some of that, I'm sure, going on. And then there's, frankly, though, the saturating influence of the ideology of colorblindness. I have these arguments with students of all backgrounds, and the invisibility of structural racism. Until you really look at the depths of what goes on, it doesn't look so bad socially compared to other historical moments. And then there's the worry that help is an association with inferiority, and there's so much effort to produce a mentality of inferiority to match the conditions that are being created, that anything that looks like it might produce more mental barriers is often rejected. So the story of structural racism has been on the ropes, but it's not knocked out, is my argument for sure. I think we have a lot of potential here to make significant advances in making it more legible, and that even if we change the name of it, the principles behind it seem to me to be significant. And of course, there's a wide range of research. I'm only doing some here. There's, Bonilla Silva, Lopez, Shapiro, Oliver, Lipsitz, Bobo, Crenshaw, Katz-Nelson. There's many, many amazing people. But most of that research happens in the academy. And they happen in journals and in books that the vast majority of people are not either, if they're reading them, they're not doing anything with them, that's for sure. Nobody walks up to me on the street saying, hey, did you check out Crenshaw's latest, collection? I mean, on Brown's campus, yes, but I mean, other places, these are not books there aren't even any bookstores, first of all. And these are on academic presses for which there are no, you have to go to Amazon pretty much and have to already know about it. But there have been some important journalistic trajectories recently where all of the in particular what's happened with police brutality and state murder has brought more attention to what the conditions might be around it. So I'm just, there's a couple things in particular. One, the articles about Ferguson in the New York Times and Mother Jones and also on NPR and elsewhere in the wake of, not just right after the murder of Mike Brown, but a little bit later, to talk about all of the ways these structural impediments were working to criminalize and penalize everyone in Ferguson County. And then eventually a couple of other intrepid journalists said, oh, and by the way, the other 3 counties over are actually worse, and 2 to the left are actually worse than that. So it was the beginning of this sense of like, oh wait, it's not just a band of psychos in Ferguson. This must be bigger. But then, the ball gets dropped. But there have been these moments of highly visible public spaces. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, is another example where a highly visible, accessible, journalistic piece that basically borrowed a lot, which I respect, from many scholars to make that argument. That's research that's been done, but put it in a public venue where the possibility of reaching many people was much higher. But there's a mainstream public narrative that is driven by colorblindness, but that approaches this kind of information with 3 particular strategies. And there are others, but these are 3. One is that these are structural anomalies. right? This, just a weird one-off. Something happened and went wrong. That the criminal justice system works, just sometimes it doesn't work, Just, there's these few times over here, and well, that one was just a procedural thing, and this one, the guy had mental problems, and he lunged at him, and this other guy, he's 6'4", and this, so there's sort of like a perpetuation of anomalies. And the other one is the one bad apple. Oh, there's a rogue cop. There's just one rogue cop, right, who 17 times, nobody pays any attention to, and he's just so rogue nobody notices, but he's just one bad apple, right? But the doesn't spoil the whole tree, of course, because the system works. One is a structural anomaly, the other one's a sort of personalized one. And then the third one is just the demonization of either the victim or the community. So just recently I was going through I don't even know what kind of website, but Freddie Gray's family and others have asked the media to stop referring to him as the son of an uneducated heroin addict. It's like, well, wait, just exactly what is the value of that information here? It's like, well, if he was an educated non-heroin addict, then the police would not have done to him what they did? Is that what we're really saying? So like there's this constant sort of demonization and marginalization and reduction of the humanity of victims as a means by which to normalize status quo and render the visibility of structural racism foggy at best. So we have these three conditions that we have, even if we buy structural racism, which I'm going to just take for granted for the sake of argument that you do. If we do that, we still have these three impediments. We have the narrative, which is another problem. But the real challenges on the ground are that the discrimination itself continues in new forms and practices. So actually, it's a constant project. It's not the same thing it was even 10 years ago. Someone wrote a really interesting piece about the end of redlining, right, with subprime lending being the exact inverse of redlining, right? Redlining was, which we're going to talk about in a minute, we're not going to give you any loans. Subprime lending is we're going to give you a whole lot of really bad loans, It's just sort of like it never ends. It's like, what's the newfangled way we can create bad outcomes and take a lot of money? Banks are very creative with this. So there are new forms and practices. So you can't tackle something very easily when it's always shifting, right? You have to figure out what are the core things that seem to be continuous. The second thing is the way in which colorblind ideology and the stories hide what's going on and blames personal behavior. And the third is the special favors narrative. Because anything that smacks of special favors, people resist, and they just have a knee-jerk kind of rejection. Doesn't matter what the data is. So my argument is that research alone is not going to interrupt this interconnected set of perceptions. If it were, it probably would have done it by now, because the research is staggering. So the How Structural Racism Works project is an attempt to figure out how do we tell this story in a way that builds the kind of emotional momentum that colorblind ideology built. How do we actually make people feel connected to it in some way? So the first part was to sort of decide, okay, how do we tackle where it's happening and how do we condense it in such a way that might make it sort of graspable, because again, it really is everywhere. So I just made what I guess you'd call a kind of educated/executive personal choice decision that these 5 areas are incredibly significant, not only consequential, but dynamic and interactive. And so these are the 5. Wealth and jobs is a little complicated because it can be wealth or it can be jobs, but I kind of want to do both, so I don't know. We'll just come back to that. But I think they both have to be involved. But these areas, I'm calling them 5, even though it's kind of like 5 and a half. Areas are extremely important, and they're going to be at the core of examining these processes of structural racism. But as they're listed here, you see them, and as they are in this image, they are operating in their own spheres, right? There's a real sense that the media and criminal justice and housing, wealth, and education have their own circumstances, and they're operating independently. This is often how we talk about this. We talk about them as single sphere. We look for housing discrimination and we look for a legacy of it, but we don't think about how it connects to all these other factors. So part of the vision of the project is to put these gears in relationship to one another. Now the gear metaphor is also in progress. I give you 5 critiques of it anytime in the Q&A. I'm not sure it's going to work, but the main purpose of it as a placeholder right now is to, one, explain that the system is designed to reproduce these disparities, right? So it's not a one-off, it's not a bad apple. It's a history of intentional, constant reproduction through different mechanisms, and that they're interactive and interconnected along multiple pegs, that you could start this in any number of places and connect them in different ways, and that they reinforce each other. So, it's not a single sphere set of problems. If we end mass incarceration tomorrow, we'll still have a tremendous level of problems in many other spheres that are interactive with mass incarceration, but entirely independent of it in many ways and connected to other things. So it's interdependent, interactive, and compounding. So this is, thinking of it this way and figuring out how to tell the story this way seems to be one of the goals so far. So, okay, so let's say we take the housing gear. Now, this gear could have like 10 more pegs with policies, but just imagine this gear here to describe some of the main policies that have happened over time to create really black communities slash, constrained, ghettoized black communities often. The policies that have done that along with many other things. So these are just a handful. There are many others. But when you take them together, they have pretty much gutted the ongoing stability of predominantly black or mainly African American and Latino communities. So they devalued these communities and the property owners in them and their property, created incredibly high hurdles for ownership of homes and businesses, and in an indirect way transferred risks that would otherwise be disparate across society, that by creating pockets of privileges and resources and buffer zones, troubles and problems are disaccumulated from one area and hyper-accumulated in communities of color. So these transferred social risks not only reproduce themselves and compound themselves, but they preserve racialized benefits for whites. And finally, just a couple of other things. It stigmatizes the very idea of community, and you'll see in a minute how that happens. So that just the idea of black community is itself stigmatized. Patricia Williams has a terrific little book on this where she talks about how, it's a long story, so I won't tell it because I don't have enough time, but basically she talks a bit about how her own identity as a black community member is something she herself should be afraid of. Right, because it creates its own sense of risk, and that your own association with yourself is actually a dangerous activity for your own financial well-being. But so let's look at redlining for a moment, because it's such a big one. Redlining and the homeowners loan corporation and the FHA operated from 1933 to 1977 until it was outlawed to redline American city neighborhoods use a color-coded system for determining which neighborhoods were suitable and which residents were suitable for loans. So they took cities. You can find these maps all over Google. They're still in existence. I mean, you can see the old maps. And if it was green and you were put in green, you got a rating of an A, and that the basis for the rating was entirely racial. It was about being an all-white neighborhood and lacking a single foreigner or Negro. If you got a red marking, now there were grades in between, so the more you became of color, it would say dangerous mixed race communities with Latinos, Asian Americans, and blacks. But that was, I forgot the exact color it was between red and green, but there was a gradation system. But the worst possible rating, for which there was no lending, were neighborhoods where any black people lived and where they were therefore given the lowest rating and ruled completely ineligible for home and business loans. It didn't matter how many, and it didn't matter what their social class was. Not that it should, but it's just a point to be made. And these were partnerships between government and private businesses designed to stabilize and expand home ownership for some communities, but not these others. And there were literally, this had nothing to do with credit, had nothing to do with jobs, it had everything to do fundamentally with a state and government and private enterprise transfer of value and privilege to the category of whiteness. George Lipsitz calls this a possessive investment in whiteness, that the nation makes an investment in whiteness. And then, of course, people are going to want to hold on to it because it has value, and they're going to want to protect it because it is being rewarded. Okay, operating in the same landscape, another significant bill was the GI Bill. Now, this was actually a colorblind bill. It was meant to be for all GIs returning home from World War II, and GIs in general. And the plan was to expand middle-class possibilities for families. And of course, this was a highly patriarchal law because there weren't too many women in the military at the time. So this was kind of a patriarchal idea of sort of starting families and giving them a starter home as the head of the household. So 8 out of 10 men born in the 1920s, 16 million veterans were eligible and participated in this program. The government spent $95 billion on giving support for home ownership to veterans. But FDR was unable to get the bill passed unless he gave specific control mechanisms for who would get the money to southern states and local district managers. And once you made that move, which is also what happened to Social Security for the exclusion of domestic worker benefits, for example, you create a context in which you basically don't have to give any money to black veterans, which is pretty much what happened. Some were given benefits, but they were profoundly underrepresented. But it was through a colorblind legislation. Fair Housing Act of 1968 is happy news, except in the version I'm going to tell you right now, which is that it was fought for and it was lobbied for, and it was an amazing piece of legislation, along with many other civil rights acts of anti-discrimination law. And this banned discrimination in all the places. This is just a few. Intimidation and coercion, because there was constant threats to black people if they moved into white neighborhoods. There was racial steering. We're like, oh, we don't have any homes over here, but we have them over here. Blockbusting, in which neighborhoods were intentionally broken up so that profits could be gleaned and so white flight could be accelerated, and slumlords could exact higher prices for worse maintained properties, and redlining. So it was passed by Johnson with an aim of, creating, this is in some sense, an anti-discrimination law that's trying to level the housing playing field. But the person who had to deal with it was Richard Nixon, because it happened at the end of Johnson's term, and Nixon was not all so excited about this. He called it forced integration and consistently interrogated his staff, fired people who tried to implement it, and one of them was actually George Romney, but that's another story. But ultimately, basically wanted to know how narrowly can he understand this law and still abide by it. But he wasn't naive about its effects. In a private memo to his closest advisors, he wrote, "I realize that this position will lead us to a situation in which blacks will continue to live for the most part in black neighborhoods, and where there will be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools." So this was not like, hey, I don't know what the outcome will look like. So between 1974 and 1983, not a single dollar was withheld from any city or town that may have been practicing housing discrimination. So if you, again, we don't have time here today to go into the depths of how it works, but I guarantee you somebody did. And not one single dollar. Here's a law, what happens? Nothing, right? So this is, again, why colorblind ideology is so dangerous, because it relies on the use of a law and not the actual application and implementation of it. Of course, Ronald Reagan choked off the enforcement even further in all of the new laws people tried to pass to get around them. So what we're talking about here is a set of practices and policies and behaviors on the ground that have created, structurally speaking, incredibly fragile and economically deprived and highly burdened neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are carrying the risks and accumulated disadvantages that are produced in other parts of society in very compacted spaces. In fact, the entire logic of the notion of a ghetto, which was not a black phenomenon originally, but when you say the word today, pretty much that's what people think, is actually a construction, right? It is an intentional construction. But the power and legacy of housing discrimination is much more powerful when you think about it in relationship to the spheres that are around it. So very briefly, I want to just help you think about how these gears might interact. So the most obvious one, for those of you who already studied this material, is that the primary way we fund education and public schools in the United States is through what? Taxes. What determines property taxes? The value of your house. So now if you've had 100 years of no home ownership because you have been denied loans, or high-risk loans that mean you have high levels of foreclosures that you actually qualified not to have but were given anyway, and economic discrimination in other spheres, you're not going to have a tax base to generate the kind of resources for schools in your neighborhood. So here you have an educational outcome where the institution of education is understood as the great leveler, right? This is going to be the great equalizer. Everyone works hard in school. It's a meritocracy system. They get out the other end and everything works out. What you see here is a very clear and easy kind of educational intersection. And there have been really vivid stories about neighborhoods working very hard to hold on to these resources now. So I don't know if you remember the Kelly Williams Bolar story that took place in Akron, Ohio, and the township, I forgot the full name of it, it'll come to me, just west of Akron, Ohio, in which she sent her 2 daughters to this all-white township. It's literally a quarter-mile away. It's 85% black Akron, 96% all-white something township. This is not good. They basically followed her around and had a private eye investigate to prove that she did not live in the township, that she lived in Akron, even though her father lived in the township. That wasn't adequate explanation enough, and because she wouldn't agree to a fine and to pay for the taxes for the school in the other township, they were going to throw her in jail. Mind you, this is an open enrollment state. Actually, all areas are supposed to participate in the educational system equally. You're not even supposed to have boundaries. Basically, open enrollment means anyone can apply to any school in the state. But what? Rich neighborhoods opt out. They opt out of open enrollment and then just pay the state back because they have so much money in property taxes. They literally write a check to the state of Ohio and say, we don't need to participate. We do enclosed enrollment. Here, take your dough. Right? But they were going to charge, Kelly Williams Bolar. So these become really significant kinds of intersections. Now, there are many others I'm not going to have time to go through here, but you can imagine pretty easily if you think, for example, even if we take the notion of ghettoization and think about it, as we've been talking about, these neighborhoods here, you obviously have a tremendous capacity for racialized policing, right? If you segregate people and put them under full surveillance, you have a capacity to create 2 tiers of a system without really anybody else noticing. So you notice before all of the last 3 years of focus on police brutality, there still is, but there was a tremendous amount of skepticism. Oh, police wouldn't do that. I've never seen a policeman do that. Well, if you live over here, you saw a policeman do this all the time. It's not a question, right? So you have a deep interaction here where, for example, you can have a war on drugs in this neighborhood, right, assuming this here is a black neighborhood, you can have a war on drugs in this neighborhood even though black people do not use drugs at any rate higher than whites. In fact, they use many of them less. But nobody else ever gets their pockets turned inside out on a constant basis. Stop and frisk only works in a segregated context. You can't just go around stopping and frisking Wall Street bankers. It doesn't really work out so well. Housing generates a tremendous amount of wealth. It's the most significant wealth transfer for most citizens. If you have any family issues with health or with educational needs, it's second mortgages, it's home property. The transfers of all this wealth away from minority communities and into wealthy white communities has been tremendously significant, intergenerational. It's not just a one-time transfer. It's the money that keeps giving. We talked a bit about education, but then I want to talk here a little bit about what's happened in the same last 40 years, which is the kind of fixation and culturalization of black ghetto life. The idea that the ghetto is a black cultural space and that it's not a structural formation, and that it's not the product, that street culture and gangs and drugs and guns and sex trade and fill in the blank, whatever the alternative economies, largely in very fragile and disrupted communities, get understood as a black thing, right? A cultural thing. And if you really pay attention to what happens in this same 40-year period, and it's an ever-narrowing description of black life so that it's only really black when it functions as a mirror of the stereotype of the ghetto. So the ghetto becomes not a form of structural racism, not a form of deprivation of circumstances and oppression, but a kind of cultural choice. I chose the ghetto. I open up the paper, I want to live somewhere. They say a ghetto apartment, I circle it. I go visit. Because I'm interested. I think I can just do my thing in the ghetto, right? And so then you have, ghettopoly, if you remember that brief game, Monopoly for the ghetto, which, thank God they pulled that one. But, there are these many, many principles, and, commercial hip hop, as those of you who know my other work is about, pretty much becomes it's most profitable in the marketplace when it takes that framework as its primary understanding for commercial mainstream artists. So there are many other examples we could talk about here, and there's a monumental set of forces that are happening. So of course this is daunting, but at the same time there have been amazing points of entry. And part of the value of this structure, as opposed to others, at least as I see it now, is that it provides lots of points of entry that can be accumulative in value. So one quick example, and I'll give more if need be, but I want to stop now to make sure we have time to talk. But, the Ban the Box movement. I don't know how many of you know about the Ban the Box? A few hands? That's pretty good. That's great. So the general principle at first was to outlaw the use of the requirement that anyone who was a felon or went to jail would have to check a box to say so, which is just adding stigma on top of stigma, like, as if it's a permanent life sentence. You're always on your way to jail, right? You can't just have done it. So if you check the box, they found, of course, lo and behold, ex-cons didn't get hired. What a shock and what a surprise. And then be a black ex-con. Oh, good, terrific. That's going to be really helpful. So they were trying to ban the box for jobs, but what the movement has moved to is ban the box for housing applications. Because if you find housing applications now, they say, have you been a felon or been a prisoner? And now there's been a movement to even not allow people who live in public housing to have relatives who are returning from prison to live in public housing. So you have a sentence that is now, destabilizing your whole family and community that you never end. So the Ban the Box has been a really terrific movement that has moved across. There have been tremendous fair lending organizations. There's been a county in Maryland, I guess it was Montgomery County, a wealthy county that actually required developers to put affordable housing in their programs, otherwise they wouldn't approve the plans. And they've been successful for many, many years, although there's a lot of pressure to stop it, to create at least a multi-class, multi-race county under tremendous pressure. Organizations like Color of Change are also really exciting to me because of the way they've intervened in the narrative and in the political activism, sort of galvanizing, using mainly social media to have leverage. But they've been really significant around banning some of the cultural work recently, like the show Cops on Fox Television, which has been 25 years of just free-for-all of racial insult on these questions around criminalization of the poor. So the goal here is to figure out how to pay attention to these intersections and to use existing research, but to make sure that we're really invested in building public community about ideas that may not yet have mainstream support. There's no way we're going to know all there is to know about structural racism, so of course we want to keep learning and keep growing. And we want to share this information because the people who know it best are the people who are applying for loans and having these experiences, applying for insurance and getting triple the rate because of their zip code. But even in this media-rich environment, the power to marginalize important information remains strong. And this to me is a mandate, seems to me, for education, for college and graduate and professorial work. That we can't just imagine that these ideas can just be put in a journal, put in a newspaper, or commented somewhere, and that they're just going to have the proper level of reach. And I think at this point, it's actually a little bit irresponsible to have this kind of information, have this kind of crisis, and to not be interested in figuring out how to connect with people and to put this in the public eye. So this project at its heart aims to encourage everyone, some people who know something's wrong, some people who may not yet know something's wrong but need a little bit of encouragement about what's wrong, but they know, the ones who do know, they may not be sure what it is, but they want a pathway to make it right. And so I'm hoping that we can use the visual and the emotional engagement to bring these ideas to the public. Thank you very much.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping and believing that you're great. I'm hoping and believing that you are fine from where you're watching us from. Now, there's something that I want to talk about, really important. And I think this is being highlighted in one of what Tricia Rose says. But first of all, I want to thank you all for those who are watching my video, for those who are supporting me, for those who are sending me the cash app, those who are donating on my super thanks. Until then, there are key aspects that Dr. Tricia Rose highlights. It's the historical foundation of structural racism, which is deeply rooted in colonialism, slavery, and segregation. She argues that structural racism was not an accident, but a deliberate construct designed to maintain white dominance. From the legal codifications of slavery to Jim Crow laws and redlining policies, the United States has systemically built racial hierarchies into legal and economic frameworks, even after the formal end of segregation. The structures did not simply disappear, but instead transformed into new forms, such as mass incarceration, economic exclusion, voter suppression. The persistence of these disparities is not due to personal failures within racialized communities, but rather the cumulative effect of institutional barriers that have been placed for centuries. Right, get it right. You know, when they say all these things or try to push all these lies about black people, to them, it's normal, because at the end of the day, they'll say and they'll go where they'll go. But the effects that will be felt will lead to a lot of loss to black people. Because how many times are we seeing black experts denied, right, the roles that they could do perfectly? But they got denied this just because they are black, just because of the stereotype that if you want your thing to fail, give a black person. All these stereotypes that have been embedded, right, in the fabric, in the culture of the United States, and this makes people see black people differently. And we have Dr. Tricia Rose, who is trying to deconstruct all these false narratives about black people. I'm also going to be talking about institutions play a critical role in maintaining structural racism, as they function in ways that disproportionately disadvantage black and brown communities while privilege white populations. Ross explores how education, the criminal justice system, housing policies, and labor markets are all shaped by racialized policies and practices. For example, the education system, which is often framed as a great equalizer, is deeply segregated and equally funded. Schools in predominantly black and in Latino neighborhoods receive significantly fewer resources than those in affluent white areas, leading to disparities in education outcomes. These schools are more likely to have underqualified teachers, outdated textbooks, and fewer extracurricular programs, of all which contribute to a circle of disadvantage. The school-to-prison pipeline further exacerbates the issue, as black students face harsher discriminatory measures than their white peers, increasing their likelihood of involvement in criminal justice system. Ross emphasizes that these patterns are not as a result of individual choices, but are built into in the way institutions function. And that's how they want all this to run. That's how they want the institution to function, because they'll sell to you all these lies, and they'll make sure that black schools, black colleges don't get all these facilities, while this is the opposite of what's happening in other facilities, right? And this affects a lot of things because to them, they believe that black people don't deserve to have good schools with good facilities. That's what they believe. I'm also going to be talking about economic disparities. Economic disparities are another central focus of Ross' analysis of structural racism. She talks how systemic exclusion from wealth building opportunities has created a massive racial wealth gap that persists to this day. Black Americans, for instance, were denied access to wealth accumulation through policies such as the denial of land ownership during Reconstruction, redlining in the mid 20th century, and an ongoing discriminatory lending practices. I'm going to talk about this because they are correlated. You see, white folks were getting loans, black folks were being denied loans. That is called the discriminatory law in discriminatory lending, because black people didn't have the land and they had nothing to use as security, right? So when white folks had these lands, they gotten loans, and in turn they used it to grow themselves. While in turn, black people didn't get these loans. Black people didn't get the chance to have the opportunity to explain themselves because they didn't have a security or something that can show or something that can prove that they are capable of utilizing this money. As a result, they didn't get the loan, and this further increased the wealth gap between white folks and black folks. The policies like redlining that were put to black people also, made them ahead all this problem. Even in modern times, black home buyers face higher mortgage interest rates, and black entrepreneurs receive significantly less investment capital compared to their counterparts, white people. The racial wealth gap is not merely a reflection of personal financial decisions, but a consequence of structural policies that have systemically disadvantaged black communities while facilitating white wealth accumulation. Without addressing these structural barriers, economic inequalities will continue to widen, reinforcing racial hierarchy across generations. Also going to talk about housing segregation. Housing segregation is one of the most visible manifestations of structural racism. And Ross explains how it is not simply a product of individual choices, but rather a long history of deliberate policy decisions. Redlining, a federal housing policy that classified black neighborhoods as high risk and unworthy of investment, preventing black families from accessing home ownership, a key driver of generational wealth. Meanwhile, white families were given access to low-interest government-backed loans, allowing them to move into suburban neighborhoods that explicitly excluded black residents. Even after legal segregation ended, these patterns persisted through mechanisms like predatory lending and gentrifications, which continue to displace black communities from their homes. The consequences of housing segregation extended far beyond real estate. They affect access to quality education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and even life expectancy. Ross argues that the spatial distribution of race and resources is not random, but a fundamental aspect of how structural racism operates. Now, I'm also going to be talking about something important that if I fail to talk about, I'll really be lying in this presentation. I'm going to be talking about criminal justice system. Now, criminal justice system is another institution deeply implicated in the structural racism. Ross discusses how mass incarceration functions as a modern extension of past forms of racial control, such as slavery and segregation. The war on drugs, for instance, disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities despite the rates of drug use among white population. Policies like mandatory minimum sentencing and stop and frisk disproportionately criminalized Black individuals, leading to a massive racial disparity in incarcerated rates. Once incarcerated black Americans face systemic barriers to reintegration, such as employment discrimination and disenfranchisement. The criminal justice system is not only pushes black communities more harshly, but also serves as a mechanism for economic extraction. With private prisons profiting from mass incarceration and incarcerated individuals being subjected to exploitative labor conditions. Now, Ross emphasizes that over-policing of black neighborhoods and criminalizing of poverty and not accidental but deliberately strategies that uphold racial hierarchies. I'm also going to be talking about health disparities. Health care disparities also illustrates the way structural racism operates beyond the more commonly discussed realms of education and criminal justice. Now, she highlights that black Americans face significantly worse health outcomes compared to white Americans, not because of genetic difference, but due to systemic inequalities in health access and treatment. From higher maternal mortality rates to inadequate medical care in low-income neighborhoods. The healthcare system structurally disadvantages black communities. Implicit bias among medical professions lead to undertreatment of black patients, pain and dismissal of their medical concerns. Additionally, environmental racism, where black and brown communities are disproportionately exposed to pollutants, toxic waste, and substandard living conditions, affects health outcomes. These disparities are isolated incidents but part of a broader system that continuously places black lives at greater risk. Dr. Tricia also, she critiques the role of media in reinforcing structural racism by shaping public perception of black people in ways that justify their continued marginalization. The media has historically portrayed black communities through a lens of criminality, dysfunction, and dependency, creating a narrative that legitimizes racist policies and institutional neglect. When black people are disproportionately depicted as criminals in news coverage, it influences public attitudes towards policing and incarceration. Similarly, when black poverty is framed as a result of personal failure rather than systemic exclusion, it shifts responsibility away from institutions and onto individuals. Ross argues that the structural narratives are not simply reflections of reality, but active contributions to the maintenance of structural racism as they shape policies, decisions, and public discourse. So I think it's important for us to address these issues because they happen. That was the presentation in regards to what Dr. Tricia Rose talked about structural racism. This is a presenter, Agent Stories, and I'm hoping to see you on my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.